Welcome to today's webinar, Soaking Up the Sun, Policy Options to Achieve State Solar Goals, brought to you by NCSL. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Glenn Anderson. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. The hosts today are ourselves, National Conference of State Legislatures, and the National Association of State Energy Officials. And I'm Glenn Anderson, NCSL Energy Program Director, and we'll be moderating today's webinar. For those of you unfamiliar with our two organizations, NCSL is the largest bipartisan organization serving the legislators and staff from the states, commonwealths, and territories. And NASIO is the only national nonprofit association for governor-designated energy officials from each of the 50 states and 6 territories. So next, my colleague Megan Cleveland will be discussing our recent publication. So welcome, Megan.
Great, thank you, Glenn. And thank you all for joining us once again for today's webinar. Before we begin, we just wanted to highlight a recent report that was developed by NCSL and NASIO. It's called Here Comes the Sun, and it is a comprehensive policy handbook for state legislators, legislative staff, and energy officials. The publication is designed to allow them to examine and evaluate their state's distributed solar policy. We wanted to provide a brief mention of the report and some of the topics covered in it. As you can see, the report spans many areas of state solar energy policies and programs. We've incorporated a number of graphs, maps, and questions for policymakers to consider, as well as a resource list. Please feel free to click the link below to download a complimentary copy of this report.
All right. Thanks, Megan. So with that, I will be proceeding to the core of the webinar. Our presenters today will be exploring a number of policy options that have been effective in achieving state solar policy goals, as well as case studies highlighting these state efforts. This webinar is being recorded, and registrants will be able to view the recording and the presentation on NCSL's website after it is posted within the next few days, and we'll be sending out an email shortly after it's posted with a link to these resources. We also have 4 fantastic presenters with us today, and want to let you know that you can pose questions to them at any time by entering them in the chat box in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. And they will be answering your questions after the final presentation. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, who is Austin Perea, an analyst with GTM Research that covers downstream demand for the U.S. solar market. He's the lead analyst for the quarterly U.S. Solar Market Insight Report series as well. So please join me in welcoming Austin Perea to the webinar.
All right, thank you, Glenn, and thanks to NCSL, of course, for putting this on. Great to be here speaking again. As Glenn mentioned, I am Austin Perea. I work as a function of GTM Research, which is, as Glenn mentioned, a part of Green Tech Media, focusing largely on the state of distributed solar. So to kick us off here, I'm going to just kind of give a Q3 update, basically the first half of the year, what has happened within the solar space, both with respect to policy initiatives and how that's impacted the market, in addition to competitive landscape trends and how companies are addressing the market. So to start us off, in the first half of the year, had a pretty significant year as far as solar installation goes. The U.S. solar PV market installed over 2 gigawatts, that's specifically in Q2, which is up 12% year over year and 8% quarter over quarter. Now, the largest share of that was coming from the utility scale segment. That was about a 1.4 gigawatts. And in any given year, this accounts for the vast majority of solar installations. So in this particular quarter, it accounted for over 60% of U.S. solar capacity. So there's a lot happening on the utility side, but due to major elements of solar being discussed and determined by regulatory authorities, mostly affecting distributed solar, the majority of this presentation is really going to focus on what's happened within the distributed solar space. So the distributed solar, as far as non-residential goes, it was up about 10% over Q1 of 2017 and actually up over 30% on a year-over-year basis. So relatively good quarter for the non-residential, or as what we determined basically commercial and industrial, in addition to community solar installations, were up on both a quarterly and a year-over-year basis. The residential sector, however, has been struggling, and that continued into Q2 of this year. We saw over 560 megawatts installed, but that's basically only 1% up from Q1 of 2017, so essentially flat on a quarterly basis, and is actually down 17% on a year-over-year basis. So I think it's worth taking the time to really unpack what's happening within the residential space, because for so long this has actually been really one of the high growth segments of the solar PV. Of the solar PV generation segment. So what we've seen really over the past few years is residential solar growing really by leaps and bounds, seeing hockey stick like growth over the past 5 or 6 years. But really peaking in Q2 of 2016, what we've seen is actually a 17% decrease on a year-over-year basis, basically since Q2 of 2016. And so when you take a step deeper into some of the data and look what's happening on a state-by-state basis, what you'll know is that the top 5 states for solar account for basically 70% of national installation volumes in any given quarter, and that was also the same in Q2. California accounting for the vast majority of that at over 40% of national installation volumes. And what's happening is that when you're looking at the actual growth rates for these states, we've seen a downward trend. There has been some spikiness to what's been happening within these states, but by and large, there's a downward growth projection. And what we've seen specifically in California is that it actually hit that point. It hit a point of a year-over-year contraction in growth, really going back to the second half of 2016. And remarkably, what's unique about Q2 is that it marks the first quarter in which all top 5 markets actually experienced year-over-year decline, which really speaks to some of the weakness and slowdown that we're seeing across these major state markets that really accounts for a large and significant share of overall installation volumes. So because California is really a decent about over 40% of overall installed capacity, I think it's worth taking a deeper look at what's happening in the nation's largest residential solar market. And so what we've done here at GTM Research is try to look at installer types in terms of in terms of how much they actually install in any given quarter. So you see here on the graph to the left, we'd like to bucket specific installers into how much they've actually installed in a particular quarter to see if there are trends along those lines. And what we've seen over the past few quarters is that while the middle market, local regional installer that is installing anywhere from 1 to 10 megawatts a quarter, that can be anywhere from regional installers that are only specific to California to smaller national installers with a smaller footprint. These installers have largely been relatively flat when you look at the year-over-year basis over the past few quarters. But the smaller kind of mom-and-pop shops who are installing less than 1 megawatt a quarter have been actually decreasing significantly despite seeing some uptick in Q2 of 2017. And importantly, installers that are installing more than 10 megawatts in any given quarter, which is effectively the big 3 installers, SolarCity, Sunrun, and Vivint, have seen a pretty significant drop in their overall installation volumes over the past few years. And taking even a further step into that, you'll see that SolarCity actually accounts for the largest share of this downturn that we've seen. So while the rest of the market is also seeing, to some extent, contraction in terms of year-over-year growth, SolarCity started to see contractions year-over-year really beginning in Q2 of last year, Q2 of 2016. And has only kind of seen the bottom out despite still being 40% or contracting 40% 10% on a year-over-year basis in this most recent quarter. So while SolarCity cannot, and some of the larger installers can't necessarily be blamed for all of the decline that we've seen in installation volumes, they are accounting for a disproportionate share of overall national installations. And because of that, the weakness and pullback from those specific installers has impacted the growth rates for California. And taking a step back here, specifically what's happened in Q2 of 2016 is that we have seen this start to impact Northeast markets. And so while most of the downturn that we've seen over the past year was concentrated specifically in California, looking ahead and looking at this past quarter, we've seen that a significant share of major Northeast markets started to see a downward trend. So New York started a downward trend, and while Maryland has seen some spikiness and actually peaked at the end of 2016, it's also on a downward trajectory. Likewise, when you take a look at the growth rates, this graph on the right, you'll see that New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, as well as Maryland have all seen year-over-year contractions in their growth rate, which is speaking to kind of the trend that's happening with respect to SolarCity and some of the larger players really pulling back their installation volumes. And so what this graph shows is, especially kind of looking more at a national level, what's happening across these shares. So for the longest amount of time, going back into 2012, much of the growth that we've seen in the national market was a function of the rise and the incredible growth rates seen from SolarCity, Sunrun, and Vivint, really peaking in 2014 when we saw over 100% growth. Recently, what we're seeing is a downward trend across. We expect, while basically growth for these large national players was flat in 2016, we expect this to be relatively worse and larger in 2017 going forward. And then it's also important to note what's happening in the space of third-party ownership versus direct ownership. So just to kind of dive into what's happened within the national installer space is that there's been a pivot towards profitability. And so a lot of these installers up until this point were focusing on a third-party ownership model and have since really tried to pivot towards selling more cash and loan sales in an effort to get cash flow positive. And so what we've seen is a decline in the share of third-party ownership across the national landscape going into 2017. And then the real kind of crux of the issue, and while we're seeing what we're seeing across these installers, is that by and large, larger installers have a much more difficult time actually acquiring customers, and have a much more difficult, and indeed it's much more costly than it is for the longer tail of installers. Basically, national installers experience 3 times higher cost of customer acquisition than long-tail installers that are able to basically leverage referrals and other kind of regional networks. So that kind of explains what's happening across the national installer landscape. So all that said, it's important to note too that it's not all negative. Some major state markets, including California and a lot of the major Northeast markets, are seeing some pretty precipitous declines in growth. That said, there are a handful of emerging state markets that are very much being enabled by strong policy that are enabling these states to really grow. And Utah, South Carolina, Texas, and to a lesser extent Florida and Pennsylvania have been states that have recently crossed a kind of 10 megawatt per quarter threshold and are quickly becoming what we're categorizing as emerging state markets. And some of those are actually reaching the ranks of the top 10 kind of state market. So, while there is a lot of, there's a lot of pullback from the national installers, I think it's just important to note that regulatory and policy wins do have potential to open up new markets. A great example of that is what's happened in Nevada recently with their decision, the AB 405 decision to restore net metering, has really attracted a lot of major market installers that actually left at the end of 2015 when the Public Utility Commission decided to roll back net metering. So AB 405 has very much opened up this market again, despite NV Energy's efforts to undermine it through a general rate case proceeding. So there are still risks to it, but it is important to note, that regulatory and policy still matters for a lot of these emerging state markets. And in addition to that, as far as our own upside goes, Illinois is another great example. Their adjustable block incentive program, which will be the findings, which will be here in just a few weeks, I believe, as far as the renewable energy credit program goes, really gives us a lot of, us at GTM Research, some upside to our forecast given the aggressive targets that they've hit. So we know regulatory policy is still important. It's not as vital in major state markets where there's relative near-term stability, but in these emerging state markets, it's really playing into a lot of how we're thinking about the long-term growth projections and trajectory for residential solar. So just to wrap up on the residential side, the major trends defining residential solar in 2017 is that the long tail installers, so everyone basically outside of those top national installers, are, because they have cheaper cost of customer acquisition and are able to scale those better, are going to be growing at a faster rate than Tesla, SolarCity, and some of the big three companies. But what this means is that we're actually going to expect a contraction in the overall market. We're actually expecting the market to contract by 3% relative to 2016. And this is all despite a pretty strong net metering policy environment, specifically in the major state markets. And so just a few things to keep in mind is that 2017 is going to mark the first time that California will fall on an annual basis this decade. We're projecting it to fall 13% relative to 2016, in large part, affecting our national installations, which we project to fall by 3% relative to 2016. In addition, 2017 also marks the first time direct ownership will drive the majority of annual installations since 2011, and that more than half of all states in the U.S. will be at grid parity in the second half of 2017. Emerging state markets outside the top 5 are going to grow 20% on the year, basically flat national level demand. And Q2 also marks the second consecutive quarter in which one of these emerging state markets that I alluded to, Utah and then Texas, actually replaces a major state market. Massachusetts, as the 6th largest market, Massachusetts historically has been a very significant market within this space, and so very notable on that side as well. And just quickly to just talk about non-residential solar, there has been less happening in the non-residential solar space. Did mention that it grew substantially in 2016, actually grew 50% in 2016 after 3 consecutive years of basically flat growth. And we expect it to grow 9% in 2017, mostly supported by what's happening in policy and incentive-driven bubbles. And so California, there's been the closure of solar-friendly rate structures that's going to lead to a down year in 2016. Massachusetts is going to see pulling of demand for the SREC2 program leading up to the SMART program transition. New Jersey has an RPS-driven cliff, or an SREC cliff rather, that should be hit basically in 2018 that will make economics very difficult to pencil for commercial customers. And New York also has a depleting pipeline of remote net metering projects that have driven growth in 2016 and to some extent 2017. But looking forward, basically, as far as the end of this, as far as the end of this year go, we are going to see a lot of incentive and policy-related bubbles kind of pulling in demand. But after that, what we're really looking for and looking towards is the growth of community solar. We actually expect community solar to drive anywhere between 40 and 50% of installations on the non-residential side, with California, Massachusetts, and Minnesota to actually be accounting for the larger share of that. So going into 2017, we're expecting over 400 megawatts of community solar. Most of that will be third-party led, so legislatively driven markets like in Colorado, Minnesota, Massachusetts, and increasingly in our 2018 and onward outlook, that's going to be more defined by what's happening in New York and in Maryland, who are kind of figuring out their programs with respect to with respect to bill credits and with also respect to the overall program legislation. So looking forward, as I mentioned, really starting in 2017 and going into 2018, community solar is going to account for a much larger share, going to be about 30% consistently of our non-residential solar outlook, with the rest of that, and especially in the out years, made up by what's happening within the solar plus storage place, which will account for anywhere between 20 and 30% of our non-residential forecast going forward into 2022. And so just to wrap up, as far as the overall solar space goes, there's macro level uncertainty with the solar trade dispute on Section 201. I'm also happy to take questions on that going forward. Also, looking at corporate tax reform presents some limited risk in addition to NEM and rate reform risk. As far as residential solar goes, we're going to see sub 12% annual growth. In the non-residential space, going to be looking more at community solar and solar plus storage in the long term. And though we didn't talk about it in this particular presentation, I'm also happy to take questions. But utility solar is on track for another boom in procurement heading into 2019 with the federal investment tax credit step downs defining kind of the growth cycle for that space. So that's it for...
All right, thank you, Austin, for a very informative and detailed presentation. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you have any questions for either Austin or our other presenters, please enter them in the lower left-hand corner in the question box there, and we will be posing those to our presenters at the end of the after the last presentation. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is Galen Barbos, research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Galen is one of the principal investigators leading the group's solar energy-related research activities with a focus on utility rates and regulatory policy for distributed solar. So Galen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, everybody. Really glad to be here. So I'm going to talk through a few issues related to reforms to net rules and retail electricity rate structures for distributed solar customers. Just to give a sense for what I'm going to walk through, I'm going to start by providing just a quick overview of the general landscape of these reforms, kind of giving a sense of the scale and scope of those activities. Then I want to dig into one of the issues that's really been at the center of many of these reform efforts, and that's this idea that existing net metering rules and rate structures are leading to higher electricity rates for non-solar customers, and thereby shifting costs onto those customers. I want to talk then a little bit about some of the implications of these reforms for the solar sector in terms of the customer economics of solar and adoption rates. And then finally, I'd like to broaden the discussion just a little bit by talking about some of the other kinds of strategies beyond net metering and retail rate reforms that can address some of the same underlying concerns, but in a way that's potentially a bit less contentious and more constructive. So to start out, I think it's useful just to acknowledge that net metering and retail rate reform efforts for distributed solar customers are really a national phenomenon. It's not just happening in California and Hawaii and Arizona and places where there's really high levels of solar penetration, but also in states like Oklahoma and Indiana, Mississippi, places where the distributed solar market is still very much in its infancy. And that's illustrated here on the map, which I've cribbed from the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, one of their recent 50 States of Solar report, and it just kind of highlights this issue that basically every single state in the country, with the exception of a few, had some action on net metering or rate reforms for distributed solar last year. The specific reforms that have been put forth come in many shapes and sizes, as illustrated by this very high-tech, beautiful graphic here. So these reforms include, for example, increased fixed customer charges, demand charges, which are common for commercial customers but are increasingly being advanced for residential customers as well, time-varying prices. Those particular reforms, which really involve changes to underlying rate designs, aren't necessarily specific to distributed solar customers. And indeed, some of what's motivating these reforms is really just the growth of distributed energy resources more broadly. So not just distributed solar, also energy efficiency, storage, demand response, etc. In contrast to those reforms that are focused on the underlying retail rate design, some of the others are really more specifically targeted to solar customers and involve changes to the structure of net metering. And so the prime example of that is where solar customers, rather than getting paid the retail rate for the electricity that they generate from solar, are instead compensated at some other price. And in some cases, that alternative compensation rate is applied just to what is exported to the grid, and that's sometimes referred to as net billing. And that particular reform is definitely on the table in a number of states. Now, there are a number of different motivations underlying these reforms. The one we tend to hear about the most is this issue of cost shifting, which I'll dig into on the next few slides. And this is just the idea that utilities have fixed costs, or more precisely embedded costs, and that solar customers aren't paying their fair share of those costs, which results in higher rates for everyone else. So I'm going to talk about that and kind of unpack it a little bit more on the next slide. There is a second set of concerns that are also distributional in nature, but instead relate to the effects on utility shareholders. So utilities are, of course, in the business of selling electricity, and they generally make more money for their shareholders by selling more electricity and by building more stuff to generate and deliver that electricity. And so activities by electricity customers, such as installing distributed solar, which reduce the amount of electricity they're consuming, that tends to negatively impact utility shareholders, and that's another kind of motivator behind some of these reforms. The third motivation listed here, economic efficiency, is this principle of providing price signals to electricity consumers that more accurately reflect the marginal cost of production, specifically the long-term marginal societal cost. And this is kind of the holy grail for economists, and is the underlying motivation for electricity rate reform is really much more broadly, not just for distributed solar customers, but this is kind of the principle motivating kind of the desire for more kind of time and locationally differentiated electricity prices. As I said, I want to kind of dig into this issue of cost shifting a bit. My intent here is to provide some context, some frame of reference, just to help assess how significant this issue might actually be, and how much time and effort to devote to addressing it. So the first thing to note is that when we talk about cost shifting from distributed solar, we're effectively talking about how it affects retail electricity prices. And that's the mechanism by which any cost shifting would occur. And those impacts on retail electricity prices are basically a function of three things. The price that solar customers receive for their generation, whether that's retail rates or something else, the value of that generation to the utility, often that's talked about in terms of avoided costs, and then thirdly, the penetration rate of distributed solar, how much solar is on the utility system. And so the figure here shows the range in rate impacts from distributed solar under three different penetration levels. At the top is the impact at current U.S. average penetration rates. Next is at the projected U.S. average penetration rate in 2030. And then at the bottom, the kind of cross-hatched bar is for a 10% penetration rate, where 10% of the retail electricity consumption is being supplied by distributed solar. And there are really only a handful of utilities in the country that are at that level now, and maybe 3 or 4 states that might get there by 2030. So that 10% is very much atypical. But not unachievable, certainly. And so for each of those three penetration levels, we show kind of a range in the potential rate impacts, reflecting a range in the underlying assumptions about the value of solar. That was one of the three things I said that kind of drives this rate impact. And you can see that depending on those assumptions, the rate impacts might be either positive or negative. That's why the bars straddle 0. But at the extreme, where you have a very low value of solar and therefore relatively high rate impacts, we're looking at something on the order of, say, a 0.5 cent per kilowatt hour impact for a utility with that sort of 10% very high penetration level of distributed solar, and then obviously much lower rate impacts for sort of more average penetration levels. I should note that these calculations assume full net metering with no fixed customer charges or demand charges. And so under most other kinds of rate designs or net metering rules, the impacts here would be lower or shifted to the left. And so you might be saying to yourself, okay, here's a range in potential rate impacts. Is this big? Is this small? Should I care about it? And that's why it's important to put these numbers into context a bit. And so in that vein, what I've done here is just layer onto the chart a bunch of other things that also impact retail electricity rates, just to provide some sense of scale. I'm not going to run through each of these things here. We put out a report earlier this year that presents this analysis and kind of explains how each of these ranges were derived and what they mean. The point here, though, that I want to make is just that, as you can see, these other issues potentially can have much larger impacts on electricity prices than distributed solar. That's even true when looking at sort of a 10% penetration level, and is even more evident when looking at kind of average penetration rates. And so the takeaway here is not that solar does or doesn't cause a cost shift, but rather that even if it does, the impacts are generally going to be pretty small compared to other things. And so if you're a legislator or a regulator or a staff within the state energy office, and you're concerned about energy affordability, but only have so much time and resources available to devote to that issue among all of the other competing priorities, there are probably a number of things that you can focus on other than rate reforms for distributed solar that are going to deliver a bigger bang for the buck in terms of promoting energy affordability. So that's really kind of the key message or takeaway here. Now, while rate reforms for distributed solar may not have a huge impact on electricity prices, they certainly could have a major impact on the customer economics of solar. And just to give you some sense of that, the chart here shows the various benefit streams that solar customers receive. The blue bar at the bottom represents the value of the utility bill savings to the customer. This is where net metering and rate design come in. And then, in addition to the utility bill savings, you've also got the federal investment tax credit, the green bars, and that will be phased out starting in a few years. And then, depending on the state, you may have some combination of state tax credits, rebates or performance-based incentives, and solar renewable energy certificates, or SRECs. However, in general, those various state incentives, as well as that federal tax credit, are all being phased out or will be declining in value over time. And so what that means is that in most states, ultimately all that's going to remain in terms of the financial benefits for solar customers are those utility bill savings. And so that's why the stakes are so high for the solar industry when it comes to the issues of net metering and rate reforms. And it's why efforts to advance those reforms have been so contentious in many states. And so just to give you some sense for what those reforms and the potential impacts on customer economics might mean in terms of the growth of distributed solar, the chart here shows an analysis we performed a while ago looking at residential solar growth under several different rate reform scenarios. And this one in particular focuses on a scenario where fixed customer charges are increased throughout the country. And so under a relatively extreme scenario where fixed customer charges are increased by $50 a month across the board, that's the green line at the bottom, we would see basically a 90% reduction in residential growth relative to what would occur if kind of current rates just kind of continued indefinitely. Now that's kind of a bookend case, right? Most fixed charge proposals out there aren't quite that extreme. Usually they're in fact a bit closer to $10 a month, which would still have an effect, maybe 15 to 20% reduction in residential solar growth, but obviously much less extreme than a $50 a month customer charge. But there have been some proposals out there for relatively high fixed customer charges. Sometimes this is called straight fixed variable pricing. And several utilities have proposed, or at least in one case implemented, demand charges for residential solar that are kind of in that $50 a month range. And so although I called it a bookend, it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility in terms of at least what some utilities are thinking of. So given some of these impacts, it's important to recognize that retail rate and net metering reforms are just one tool in the larger toolkit. As the last couple slides suggest, these reforms tend to be a bit of a zero-sum game, which in some cases may be unavoidable, but that is, again, why these tend to be contentious. There are, however, other kinds of strategies that can address some of the same underlying concerns, but potentially in a less contentious and potentially more collaborative manner. And so here on the left-hand side of the slide, we've identified kind of 4 broad strategies for mitigating the utility financial impacts of distributed solar, either impacts on non-solar customers or on utility shareholders. The first of these, limiting solar customer bill savings, that's where kind of most net metering and rate reforms lie. But beyond those are kind of these 3 others that we've listed here: facilitating higher value forms of deployment, broadening customer access, especially into kind of lower and moderate income communities, and then finally developing regulatory mechanisms that align utility profits and earnings with distributed solar growth. And so just to end here, I think the concluding thoughts here more or less reiterate some of the points that I already made, so I don't want to belabor them. But I think just to kind of come back to the point on that last slide, it is, I think, important going forward for states to just, before defaulting to rate reforms, in some cases it's unavoidable, but I think it's always good just to start out the process by acknowledging kind of the broader set of strategies that are available and then kind of working from there. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you all. Here's my contact information, and I'll look forward to Q&A at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Galen, for summarizing some excellent research that I think can really provide some insight to policymakers and Energy Office folks. So want to follow up with our next speaker here, who will be Angela Dickema, and she is the Director of the Nevada Governor's Office of Energy. Angie is responsible for directing, managing, and overseeing energy policy development, as well as legislative relations of the Office of Energy. So Angie, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, obviously Nevada is a good case study for all of you, as has already been alluded to with the first presentation. However, I will point out that we are still ranked #1 in solar capacity per capita. Obviously, we're talking about distributed solar and residential solar, and that has gone through some changes, so I will kind of provide the history of why we've seen such a fluctuation there and what we're doing to climb back up to the top 5. So just some quick history of net metering in Nevada. We started the program back in 1997. The legislature declared that it would be the 1-for-1 net metering, allowing customers to use energy generated by a solar energy system up to 1 megawatt. It went fine for largely a decade, up until 2011. We actually set the compliance cap at 2% of peak capacity, again established by the legislature. And a couple years later, as solar was continuing to increase and we saw more penetration levels, we increased that compliance cap again to 3% of peak capacity. And then in 2015, we had Senate Bill 374. As the rooftop solar industry continued to grow and we neared the 3% cap again, it came before the legislature again, and instead of raising the cap this time, SB 374 required that our utility, NV Energy, filed a tariff, and our PUC approved the tariff by the end of that calendar year. That would not take effect until after the date on which the cumulative capacity requirement was met. And the Bill 374 directed the PUC to set new rates to eliminate any unreasonable cost shift to non-solar customers. So this set off a series of changes in our net metering policy across the state, and we're still dealing with it today. It actually started with, here's a good follow-up to Austin's chart, which showed how it looked on a quarterly basis. We saw an unprecedented increase in net metering customer applications rushing to get in before the cap was met in the saga of SB 374. About 25,000 applications submitted in 2015, whereas only about 6,000 applications were filed in the whole 17 years prior to that legislation. So in December of 2015, pursuant to SB 374, our PUC approved a new rate class and new rates for net metered customers of our utility, NV Energy. And the new tariffs for both Nevada Power and Sierra Pacific, which make up NV Energy, placed the net metering customers in their own separate rate classes and included an increased monthly service charge and lower credit for exported energy, which was set at the wholesale market rate or avoided cost rate rather than the full retail rate. And the order originally called for a transition over 5 years to the new rates, but was later modified to transition more gradually over a 12-year period, and the netting of energy was to occur on an hourly basis. And as you've already heard, one of the most notable parts of the order was the component of the decision which made the changed rates applicable to existing net metering customers and not just future net metering customers. Needless to say, this put an abrupt halt to the growth of the residential solar industry, as several of our rooftop solar companies ceased operations in Nevada almost immediately following the decision and sent workers back to their home states. And the decision was not the outcome that our governor had hoped for. So we actually took action to convene a task force which was comprised of a diverse stakeholder group with membership defined in statutes, a statutory body. And this was used as a forum to discuss the net metering issue along with broader state energy goals and policies. And Governor Sandoval actually issued an executive order directing the task force to work with myself as the director of the Office of Energy to provide recommendations on the best energy policies for Nevada's future, including policies that support distributed generation and storage with a specific focus on rooftop solar and net metering. So one of the policy recommendations that we saw come out of the task force was to grandfather the existing net metering customers who already had systems in place or active applications for net metering prior to the enactment of the PUC's decision to change the rates. And we ended up introducing that as a bill draft request going into our last legislative session, but ultimately there was a stipulation agreement reached between the utility and the solar companies to do just that, grandfather in the existing customers at the previous rates, and so that bill was ultimately not needed. As was mentioned in the report, another change in direction after this came about as part of the general rate case last year for the northern service territory of the utility, when our PUCN issued an order allowing an additional 6 megawatts of installed capacity of rooftop solar for new customers under the prior net metering terms and rates. And the 6 megawatts was arrived at as the equivalent of 40% of the total net metering solar growth that Northern Nevada had experienced over the past 20 years, and would allow for nearly double the growth that had occurred over the previous 3 years. The order justified compliance with SB 374 by noting that any cost shift borne by ratepayers under the addition of the 6 megawatts would not be considered unreasonable under the facts presented. I did include an excerpt here from the order showing how the valuation of solar and the bigger questions were left unaddressed and instead left to future proceedings. But it does recognize our prior legislative and executive branch policy statements. So there still remains the larger issue, however, since the majority of our rooftop solar industry is in the southern part of our state, which is our utility's southern service territory. And so this is what led to Assembly Bill 405 in our latest legislative session this past year, which was already alluded to in Austin's presentation. It was introduced as a legislative solution to the net metering saga by Assemblyman Chris Brooks, and it was aptly named the Renewable Energy Bill of Rights, and that is because it included a number of consumer protections designed specifically in the interest of rooftop solar customers. So I will not go through all of these. As you can see, there are a few, but the main points are ensures renewable energy customer generators are afforded rights to generation, storage, consumption, and exportation. It establishes basic worker safety and additional transparency, accessibility, and accountability in the rooftop solar leasing and purchasing process. And it provides direction to rooftop solar customers to resolve complaints concerning solar installation companies. The major part of the bill was the reinstatement of nearly retail rate net metering in 80 megawatt tranches. So the bill was signed into law by Governor Sandoval this past summer, and it called for the immediate reestablishment of the rooftop solar market in our state. And it requires net metering on a monthly basis where the customer receives a tiered reduction in the value of the exported energy dependent on the solar penetration level in the state. It specifically called for customers to receive a credit equivalent to 95% of the retail value immediately after passage until the PUC determines that the cumulative installed capacity is equal to 80 megawatts. Then the credit drops down to 88% until the second tier of 80 megawatts is reached, followed by an 81% credit until the third tier is reached, and then ultimately it will be a 75% credit of retail rate going forward. This picture here is a little blurry, but this is the update that is required to be posted on the PUCN's website from now on, which shows a live update on the cumulative capacity statewide. So you can see I put this on the slides yesterday at noon. We had almost 9 megawatts of applied capacity. Other main components of AB 405 include a prohibition on separating net metering customers from other non-net metering customers that are in different rate classes, and also for our PUCN to open an investigatory docket to establish a methodology to determine the impact, if any, on net metering on ratepayers. Another noteworthy part of the bill, which I don't have included on the slide here, but I do want to mention, is that it included a time-variant rate schedule that the PUCN is to establish for customers with storage. So it's a good way to kind of address the integration of solar, the broader issues with meeting the ramp when solar drops off during peak in the evening. And so that is an important part of the bill that we will see developed. So the latest update, I guess, in our net metering status here in Nevada comes from the tariff filed by NV Energy earlier this summer in compliance with the bill, which was it's now part of the general rate case, but in their filing, they sought approval to increase the monthly basic service charge for all customers, including non-net metering customers, and to decrease the corresponding volumetric per kWh charge for electricity as a new blended rate. And the tariff also called for the excess electricity sent to the grid to be netted on an hourly basis rather than monthly. And it would have resulted in a much lower credit, subtracting out the public policy charges from the retail rate, and thus the 95% credit would be applied to a much lower number. However, the PUCN expedited review of the tariff and ordered that the new rate design would be addressed during our ongoing general rate case. The order did find that a regulatory asset for the utility should be established to address any undercollection stemming from AB 405, and gave the utility until the end of the month, so should be coming in fairly soon, any day now, to submit a new tariff reflecting the findings. And the investigation on impacts will be taken up separately. So net metering and valuation of solar continues to be a hot topic here in Nevada, but the policies we've implemented around distributed energy resources have made clear that our goal is to overcome the challenges created in a way that will continue to grow our economy and renewable energy jobs while also ensuring equitable treatment of ratepayers. So I will just wrap up with some of the other latest distributed energy resource advancements that we've seen coming out of our last legislative session that will hopefully help us get back up to the top 5 in our distributed solar states. We saw Senate Bill 145 come through this year, which establishes a solar energy incentive program. It requires $1 million that goes toward low-income customers per year, and also includes incentives for energy storage, helping to address the issues with time of use with solar and all that. Also creates an electric vehicle infrastructure demonstration program, so financial incentives for the industry. We saw Senate Bill 146, which is a distributed resource planning requirement, so the utility will be required to look for locational benefits and costs of distributed resources, including storage and solar, and trying to figure out how that might be useful and how to deploy that. And then Senate Bill 204 is a storage procurement targets bill, which of course is also very complementary to distributed solar. So I will end with that and take any questions at the end of the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Angie. Excellent presentation and overview of the work in your state. So our final speaker will be Representative John Zoka from North Carolina. He was first elected in 2012 and serves in the House as the Senior Chair of Energy and Public Utilities on the Energy and Public Utilities Committee, as well as Chair of the Finance Committee, Chairman of the Joint Legislative Commission on Energy Policy, and in various other capacities. So please welcome Representative John Zoka to the webinar.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I was asked today to talk about House Bill 589, the development of it, and the stakeholder process, and the components of the bill. And 8 to 10 minutes isn't enough time, so I'm going to give you a brief overview. I'll just start with this, that 589, House Bill 589, is the biggest policy change in energy policy in North Carolina in the last 10 years. Now, to get you to that, I've got to explain the past. And I'm not going to go all the way back to 1900, but I do have a point between this slide and the next slide, and you may have seen it. You know, can you spot the automobile? Kind of helped there with the little red circle in the middle. Everything else is a horse-drawn carriage. 13 years later, can you spot a horse? And the answer is, well, I can't, maybe you can, but what's going on in 13 years, which seems like a long time, but really isn't? Well, you have policy and technology. Technology came up with autos. Here in New York, what isn't shown on the slide is that actually the mayor of New York, to cater to the wealthy folks, wanted horses out of Manhattan, so they actually had a policy which helped drive this. So it's good to keep these historical events in mind to help us focus on what we're doing now, because sometimes technology leads, sometimes policy leads. In 2007, North Carolina passed what was known as Senate Bill 3, and it was our implementation of PURPA. And the point of this slide is, don't worry about the little bars there, but the boxes is what's important. 60% of U.S. PURPA projects have been built in North Carolina, which is huge. So why did we do that, and how did we get there? Well, again, hopefully you're on full screen. You can see we're number one at the top, and basically we got there because we had the highest size limits at 5 megawatts, not 100 kilowatts like the federal law says. We had the longest fixed rate term. So that policy decision in and of itself drove utility scale solar in North Carolina. And here you see a chart that just shows that very clearly. 2007, not a lot, and then it took off. And it took off a little later because we had a major solar developer here in the state who recognized this, took advantage of it, and we're off to the races. Just another example to see on this slide. You can see California followed by us on the number of projects that are actually established or in development. So let's come up to the last couple of years. We have this huge growth in solar. So what are the pressures to change policy? And this is what they are, and I put after each bullet there, like the first one is the interconnection process improvement. Who wanted it? Well, the utility wanted it, and primarily Duke Energy is our primary utility provider here in North Carolina, and solar developers wanted it. In the eastern part of the state, if you're not familiar with it, relatively flat. Land is less expensive because it's mainly farmland. And under PURPA, you can put the facilities wherever you want to, so they went where there's lots of sun, relatively inexpensive. What that caused is, over time, substation problems for Duke. You can only put so much in going in the opposite direction. You know, these systems are built on the current model and maybe the older model that it's central power plant pushing energy out. Now all of a sudden, out at the end, you've got solar plants pushing it back the other way. So both utility and the developers want it. Removing subsidies for solar and elimination of the state tax credit. That was driven by the legislature. We had determined that utility scale solar really didn't need state tax credits anymore. It was a viable industry by itself. We eliminated them in 2015. Next one, looking for market-based solutions to see renewable energy continue to be successful. And again, legislators wanted that because we have a very large, vibrant industry, employs over 26,000 people in solar installations and maintenance of facilities. And there's a number of companies in my home district here in the Fayetteville area that have grown tremendously. So jobs is important. We want to see that continue. The next bullet, talk about a fair return for investment. Everybody wants that, utilities, developers, and legislators. This was touched on in an earlier presentation, ratepayer equity, meaning no cross-subsidization of solar. That has become a huge, huge issue because of the amount of utility-scale solar that we have. There's a feeling among a lot of legislators that if you want solar, great, but don't make me or another ratepayer pay for it. So we're trying to address that issue as well. Competitive procurement, which is really market forces, you know, at or below avoided costs. And this was written into the bill. Who wanted that? Well, the utilities wanted that because to continue to be forced to buy energy because of PURPA at higher rates doesn't make sense for ratepayers, utilities, or anybody. And the last bullet there, if you have a military base in your state, is particularly important because the Department of Defense has a goal by 2025 to have each base generate at least 25% of their non-critical energy usage on post by renewable sources. With Fort Bragg, the largest military installation in the world, in my district, and I'm a retired military officer, this was of incredible importance to me. So where do we go from there? Well, this is the outcome. Okay, 589, and I'm not going to go into detail on this because this would take a long, long time. I'll just give you a couple minutes to look at this yourself and scan it and point out some highlights. PURPA reform, we had to change the system we had. Between bullet point number 1 and number 2, that was the majority of the time that we spent in discussions between the utilities and the developers and other folks. Where we go. Something unique maybe to us, I don't know, bullet number 3, the Green Source Rider has set aside a 600 megawatts of new utility-scale solar for military installations, public universities, who they would like to be 100% renewable, and other large customers such as Apple, Google, folks like that, or companies like that want to be renewable energy. So we have a set-aside in the 2660 for them. One maybe unique to us, not in a lot of other states, number 7, expedited review of interconnection of swine and poultry waste. We're the second largest producer of hogs in the nation. Hog waste with hog lagoons is an issue. It's a clean water issue. So we have put money in our state universities trying to come up with ways to turn the methane into gas. We have 8 of those facilities right now throughout the state, and we want to expedite a review of those interconnection. They don't just go in the regular queue. They get expedited when they come to the utility and the Utilities Commission. The last one, you may have heard, the moratorium on issuance of permits for wind energy. That was not in my original bill. That comes back to the military and a certain legislator who feels very strong. He has a base in his district, an Air Force base, and he thinks that wind turbines could interfere with military flight paths to and from the Dare County bombing range. And just to say, it got put in there because in the legislature, I'd rather have 85% of something than 100% of nothing. Okay, so where are the lessons? Well, we had this stakeholder process that went on for about 10 months. I've been trying to do something like this for about 3 years. It got to the point where there was pain among all the stakeholders, the legislators, the utility, everybody. So I think one of the lessons learned is there has to be some pain before stakeholders will sit down and actually negotiate. A stakeholder process, in my opinion, is essential. And we invited everybody who thinks there's a stakeholder, whether it was the utilities, the developers, every interest group from Americans for Prosperity to the Sierra Club. We invited them all. If they wanted to come and participate, great. And if they didn't, my point to them was, if we get to something you don't like, don't say you weren't asked. Stakeholder group used nonpartisan legislative staff to lead these initial 8 months of discussions. I was not involved, nor were the other sponsors, nor were any legislators. I didn't want to get in it because, as those of you who legislators know, every time a legislator comes in the room, the conversation changes. So the idea here was to get the people who have all the expert knowledge and their positions to fight for it, let them fight it out. Now, the problem with that sometimes comes into the sub-optimization thing where you get the whole group and then you break into subgroups because somebody might want to talk about rooftop as opposed to utility scale, and then you get back. So you have to be careful in the subgroups that they don't come up with an optimal solution for that, but it just doesn't work with everything else. So at some point in time, legislators have to get involved, and that's why I say let the process work until it doesn't. Then, as a legislator, you get involved. For legislators, let the process work. Don't feel like you have to have your finger in every pie because it just doesn't work. I did protect the stakeholder process, as did the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the Senate. We got commitments from everybody, and if you walk out, don't expect to be welcomed back with open arms. It's a long process. When you sign up for it, you're in. When legislators do get involved, you need to have a set of guiding principles. You need to know what it is you're trying to accomplish because it's real easy to get caught up in the eaches. Find out which issues have been resolved and which haven't, obviously. And when myself and Representative Arp, the 2 major sponsors of this bill, got involved, when I say show leadership and make the tough decisions, that's exactly what it is. That there were points in time in the final negotiations where I'd look around the room, somebody'd say, well, we need this. I'd say no. Somebody else say, well, we want this. I'd say no. Somebody else says, we want this. Yes. And sometimes you just have to negotiate on things, and it gets really tough and bloody, but nobody died. So after that happens, everybody has to sell the bill. And that quote right there, I support the bill but have concerns about. And I mentioned Americans for Prosperity and the Sierra Club. You might consider them at different ends of the political spectrum. They both started their statements in the House Energy Committee with that phrase. we support the bill, but we have concerns about, and then one group would have concerns about what the other group was in love of, and vice versa. So you have to have pain. You have to support the people in the process, and then at the right point in time, leadership has to be shown, make tough decisions, and get it across the finish line. And I put that last point in there because I'm actually pretty proud of that. We're going to save ratepayers $850 million as a result of this process over the next 10 years. And that is my presentation.
Thanks so much, Representative Soka, for a great overview of the complexity of dealing with some of these solar policy issues and the importance of bringing in a broad group of stakeholders as well. Wanted to reiterate that if you do have any questions for our presenters, please enter them in the chat box in the lower left-hand side of your screen. We do have a few questions here. I actually wanted to kick it off here with a question regarding the grid parity statement that Austin discussed, that more than half of states will be seeing grid parity by the middle of 2017, which is really significant. And I was wondering if you could kind of explain what that actually means and whether that includes, for instance, the ITC.
Yeah. Sure, good question. Yeah, so grid parity under our assumptions, and that's, I think it's the actual tick. Well, it will hit over 25 states. I think it's 28 states right now. We're expecting with the reduction, not taking into account Section 201 risks, basically, to be at 31 states at grid parity in 2018. And the way we come to that number is we are basically taking a look at both system costs on a state and regional basis, and comparing that to the levelized cost of energy, that levelized cost of energy in that state relative also as well to the retail rate. Or I mean, in most cases, in the states that we're tracking as far as grid parity goes, those states have full retail rate net metering. So the grid parity statement just means that with a solar system installed under net metering regime, taking into account the full investment tax credit, customers are able to at least offset their bill and not have any, not pay any premium for solar. And then in addition to that, so that's what, basic grid parity is. And then as far as, there's something like around the order of basically 25 states that are at a spot where you can at least get 10% year one savings on that. So not just basically, wash relative to your typical utility electric bill, but actually getting savings on that system.
And I guess, to that point, for Galen, what are your thoughts on, after seeing some of those declines in some states, whether that has to do with maybe saturation, or whether it's actually the state policy and some of these rate design policies that you were talking about, and what also, taking that into account, this plummeting costs and potential grid parity, whether that will impact some of that growth as well.
Yeah, so I mean, Glenn, you just mentioned kind of a whole host of different factors, and I mean, I think it's a confluence of all of those different things. I mean, obviously, one other driver is, incentives are declining in many places. You've got northeastern markets that are depending on solar renewable energy certificates as one sort of aspect of the financial calculus, and in some states, the value of those instruments have gone down. Certainly rate, I think both real and also sort of expectations about changes to rate structure, I think, are having an effect, right? When a customer makes an investment in a PV system, they're making some assumptions about what rates will be in place over the lifetime of their system. And, one of the kind of hot button issues that's come up in the context of net metering reform, certainly in Nevada, especially in Nevada, is this question of grandfathering. And that grandfathering issue really exists only within the context of discussions about changes to net metering rules themselves. kind of how exported generation is treated. But grandfathering really doesn't apply to the underlying rate structures, right? I mean, in California, for example, we used to have 5 tiers of inclining blocks, and now that's gotten compressed down to 2, and nobody's getting grandfathered in under the old 5-block tier structure. So I think changes to rate design, both those that have happened and also just kind of expectations and concerns about what might happen, are kind of partially responsible for kind of dampening some of that grant demand.
So we also have a question regarding potential tipping points when one combines solar with small battery storage, and what are the thoughts on when or where this tipping point might happen, and obviously grid defection is that's probably the biggest concern there, but if any of our presenters have any thoughts or projections on when that might happen, that would be a good thing to know.
Galen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say something and then get out of the way. So, I mean, I don't have a sort of a numerical projection in terms of tipping points, but definitely rate design and net metering reforms are a key driver there, especially in the residential sector. And so I mentioned one of the reforms that has been discussed and implemented in some cases is this notion of net billing, where the generation that is exported to the grid, rather than kind of banking it and getting credited for that generation at retail rates, instead the customers get compensated for that generation at something less than retail rates. In some places it's been kind of as extreme as wholesale prices. Nevada obviously is taking a much more gradual approach. But where there's that differential between the price that's paid for exported generation and the price that is implicitly paid for generation that's consumed behind the meter, that's an arbitrage opportunity. And so that's I think one of the markets that has emerged to some degree, but I think will increasingly emerge for storage. Is states that move towards net billing are going to create demand for storage. And I think the question for policymakers is that demand and that arbitrage opportunity reflective of some real underlying value to the utility?
Yeah, and good point there, Galen. And just to add on to that, and just to re-emphasize the importance of rate design, or I guess rate structure and overall policy, is that, I think as far as we're looking at, Hawaii and California are really going to be the only major markets, at least in the near, 5-year, kind of 3 to 5 year projections, at least from GTM research, that are going to be viable solar plus storage markets for precisely that reason. So California, with the transition to time varying rates and the time of use for residential customers, is going to allow that arbitrage opportunity to happen. And so we're going to expect, a growing number of residential customers start to be pairing solar plus storage. But I think, it's going to be a question not only of having those time of use rates, but also the differential and the delta between peak and off-peak periods to maximize the arbitrage. And in addition to that, there is also a market when you have demand charges, especially on the commercial side. Residential, the demand charges need to be pretty high in order to really have any demand charge management there. So probably more limited opportunity in those cases relative to having, kind of more preferential time of use structures. I know in Arizona, under the new APS settlement agreement, there is a rate, I think it's the R2 and the R3 rates, that are meant to have a demand charge and are also time varying, I believe, but don't have too much of an impact on solar plus storage economics, just given that the demand charge component isn't quite high enough to really make demand charge management a viable kind of like revenue stream for solar plus storage. So on the residential side, it's definitely going to take some time and going to very much be a function of how policymakers are structuring and regulators are structuring time of use rates. And then commercial, definitely a quicker time period just because higher demand charges in general for medium and large size commercial customers really enable that market to take off. And like I mentioned, we're expecting anywhere between 20 and 30% of our overall national commercial installations to be solar plus storage kind of in the beginning of the 2020 and on.
Great, thank you. And question for Representative Soka. You mentioned that there's concern around the cost shifting and rate design. Legislators are concerned about that. I was wondering if there's some work or preliminary efforts to discuss that and how perhaps you might be assessing the cost shifting, whether it's there and how much it might be, and what are some thoughts about addressing it in your state?
I'm going to be very direct with you right now. We have, in the legislature, have solar fatigue. That is certainly one of the issues that's on the table for us to consider in the future. But right now, getting House Bill 589 passed takes such an amount of effort by so many people that our plan right now is to let this settle in. And of course, the Utilities Commission has to write all the implementing rules. So I'm monitoring that to make sure that legislative intent is being followed. But we're going to have to let this one sit in and settle in, rather, so that we can see what's happening and how it's working before we do too much more else with that issue.
Great, and I guess with that we're running short on time. But if is there any takeaways that any of our speakers would like to add for policymakers or energy office officials that are addressing? We've talked a lot about the rate issues and those impacts, but just distributed solar challenges in general. If you have any last kind of thoughts for our audience, that would be great if you'd like to share them.
Well, the awkward silence, I guess I'll fill it. I would just say that in all types of energy legislation, the technology is moving so rapidly that you have to stay on top of what's happening and try and keep policy at least at the same level where the technology is going. And don't get too far behind, because the further you get behind, then you'll have an instance like we did in North Carolina where it became very painful for a lot of people, and it's just not good policy as a legislator, as an elected official, to let that happen. So stay on top of things and make sure you know where technology is leading so you can actually develop the right policy to supplement and enhance that technology.
Yeah, I would just add that, I spend a lot of my time looking at the market and trying to understand which factors, both from a policy perspective and from a competitive landscape perspective, are really driving installation growth, which, from a legislative perspective also means driving jobs and economic growth within that local community. And so, from the conversations that I have with both installers on the residential side and more kind of integrated developers and kind of asset owners who are more working on the commercial and industrial and community solar side, is that when it comes to structuring these programs, certainty and stability within the program, as far as whether it's net metering or with incentive programs, is generally a better way to go than kind of than uncertainty. I know that probably sounds like an obvious statement, but one of the things, like for instance, like what happened with Utah recently with the settlement agreement there established it's going to cut export rates by about 10%, but it's very clear in the guidelines of the settlement agreement between Rocky Mountain Power and the PSC about how this interim net metering program is going to play out, with very specific structure to the capacity limits and what happens after those are met. So from an installer and like a business community perspective, stability or at least rather certainty within what's actually happened, even if it is ultimately a cut to the export rate, is sometimes better than the alternative, where installers just don't know and are unable to really offer customers anything just because they don't know how the regulatory environment is going to shift. So certainty probably above all else, I think, is just something to keep in mind.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and both big thanks from NCSL and NASIO, and to all of our speakers for taking the time to join us and share your knowledge with our audience. And also thank you to our attendees for attending. And we want to remind you that the webinar will be recorded and posted along with the presentations, and we'll make those available within 5 days and be sending out an email. So thank you, and we hope to have you attending our next NCSL webinar.